Hello and welcome to this special show. No, you're not fine the way you are. That's how the latest book by Dutch historian Rutger Bregman urges people to think outside their comfort zone. The book, titled Moral Ambition, shows you a path to make a difference to the world rather than just watch from the sidelines. The author argues that a 40-year full-time career consists of around 80,000 hours, 10,000 work days or 2,000 work weeks. But how you spend that time is the most important moral decision of your life. What should be the main ingredients of moral ambition? Where to start in terms of identifying the world's problems? And do money and idealism go together? Those are some questions that the book addresses. Joining us right now is the author, Rutger Bregman himself. Bregman had made headlines in 2019 in Davos for calling out billionaires for tax avoidance and flying in private jets to talk about climate change.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. It feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? there was only one panel, actually.
Well, we've had two. You're the second of our panelists.
There was only one panel.
Let's go there.
One panel hidden away in the media center that was actually about tax avoidance. Yeah. I was one of the 15 participants. So something needs to change here.
Rutger, thank you so much for joining us on the program today to speak about your latest book, Moral Ambition. One of the lines that the book begins with is no, you're not fine just the way you are. People may spend their whole lives climbing up the ladder of success only to find, once they reach the top, that the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. Why did you feel it is important to shake up your readers and their thinking and their approach towards work and professional life?
Yeah, well, my reasoning is pretty simple. In the first place, we have a lot of very big global problems. So 15,000 kids die from easily preventable diseases every day. 85% of the world population is below the poverty line of the country in which I live, the Netherlands. We have the threat of the next pandemic that may be just around the corner. There's war, there's democratic backsliding. There are a lot of things we got to do something about. But then the second thing is that a lot of people are currently stuck in jobs that don't really add all that much of value. And I'm not talking about teachers or nurses or care workers. No, I'm talking about people who often went to great universities, who have beautiful resumes, who may be a marketeer or a banker or a corporate lawyer or whatever. And still, at the end of the day, they have the feeling that they don't really contribute all that much. There's one big study that showed that around 25% of people in developed economies even think that their own job is socially meaningless. So there's a huge waste of talent going on. And my book is basically a call to arms. It says that if you are very talented, if you have a little bit of ambition, then you should use that to make the world a wildly better place. And I call that moral ambition. It's the combination of the activism or the idealism of an activist and the ambition of an entrepreneur. When those two things come together, something really magical starts to happen.
Right. But at what stage and at what point should people start thinking about this? Because the common line that we hear when someone talks about changing the world or launching a political party or working towards a social cause is that you can't change the world, or it's better to stick to the beaten path, have a work-life balance, earn a good enough amount of money for your family, for your holidays, so that you can retire well and early. Nothing wrong with it, but perhaps, according to your book, one wouldn't be very satisfied with this way of living. But how does one come to the conclusion that you're cut out for making a difference to the world, for leaving an impact? And where do you really start off?
Well, history is littered with examples of small groups of really thoughtful, committed citizens who made a massive difference in the fight against some of the greatest problems we face as a species. In the book, I talk, for example, about the abolitionists, those who took up the fight against the slave trade and against slavery. And you got to remember that in the 18th century, in a country like the United Kingdom, for example, this was really, really unpopular. The United Kingdom was making an enormous amount of money on the slave trade and on slavery and on having this whole system of colonies. But then there was a small group of mostly entrepreneurs and businessmen who said, this is the greatest moral atrocity of our time. We should kickstart a movement against this. So it is really small groups of really committed people that can make a difference. History shows us this. And I've tried to write sort of a self-help book, a guide that people can use if they also want to follow that path. Now, I got to say, if you want to read a book that will make you more relaxed or more mindful or happy or whatever, then you should probably not read my book. There are thousands of self-help books that will teach you, how to do less. But this is a book about how you can do much more and how you can really leave your mark on history.
Right. Now, speaking about leaving your mark on history, you speak about what startup founders, young entrepreneurs can also do. You know, your book also argues, and you've said this, that a lot of times we are launching companies or launching solutions to the problems we never really know we had, or it's probably too simplistic. So what is the kind of mindset or moral ambition that young entrepreneurs need to have?
Yeah. So we got to realize that ambition, it's just raw energy. You know, it can fuel a rocket that goes to Mars, but it can also fuel a bulldozer that, waltzes over a rainforest. So it's just energy. And what really matters is how you use it. What I currently see is that there are a lot of young entrepreneurs starting new companies that, create these products that are perhaps in the best scenario, okay, but in the worst scenario are actively harmful. So there's a famous quote from someone who worked at Facebook a long time and who said that the best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click on ads. And that is pretty sad, isn't it? That you have all these really smart people who could technically do an enormous amount of good, in a country like India in particular. If you would take up the fight against some of the greatest health problems, just imagine how many lives you could save. It's honestly extraordinary. So it's always a little bit sad to me when those very, very talented people, spend so many hours on something that doesn't actually matter all that much. Maybe you can make a lot of money with it, but in the end, what are you going to think about when you lie on your deathbed? About all the PowerPoints from colleagues that you didn't see, about all the long meetings that you didn't attend, or about the actual impact you made. That's I think what really counts in the end.
Right. How would you define moral ambition today? Of course, when you hear the term, you immediately think about doing something good for society. But according to you, what would be the 4 main ingredients of moral ambition that youngsters, that entrepreneurs, industry veterans, CEOs can keep in mind?
So I co-founded an organization called the School for Moral Ambition that helps as many talented people as possible to pivot their career and to use their resources, whether it's their talent or their capital or their network, to make the biggest possible difference. And we use a simple framework to help people focus on those biggest problems. It's called the SSS framework. So we focus on problems that are really sizable, they're very big, they're solvable. You got to have some plan of, what to do about them. And most importantly, they're also sorely neglected. If you go and work on the issues that everyone else is already working on, then you're not going to make the biggest impact. So, for example, I'm someone who grew up in a rich country, in the Netherlands, in Northern Europe. If I want to, help as many people as possible and to improve their health, then, probably focusing just on the Netherlands, where we already spend a huge amount of healthcare, is not going to make the biggest possible difference. If I would shift my focus and focus on something like malaria, for example, 600,000 people die from malaria every single year, mostly kids under 5. Well, then I can suddenly do much more good, right? Because it is so neglected. So if you're really morally ambitious, you gotta dare to go where others don't go. You gotta be able and be willing to do the unpopular or the unsexy things.
Right. And does this mean, because when we hear about working for a social cause, or working for the betterment of society or world, you often hear that you need to lead an austere life. Can one have a day job where you're working as somebody in the corporate sector, have the ambition of rising up the corporate ladder, yet be an idealist? Can money making, idealism all go hand in hand together?
Well, I think that money is pretty important if you want to make a big difference. The former UK Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, she once said that the Good Samaritan, from the Bible, he didn't just have good intentions, he also had money. So yeah, if you want to make a biggest possible difference, you got to find some way to attract capital. And here, I think philanthropists or brave philanthropists can make an important difference. If you study these great movements of the past, I mean, I already mentioned the abolitionists. They weren't financed by governments. Government was not giving subsidies to these people who fought the slave trade because the government was making an enormous amount of money facilitating the slave trade. The same was true for businesses. They were certainly not giving money. So there you need very brave individuals who are willing to go against what is fashionable, against what is popular. And look, I also realize that there are a lot of young people who are like, well, how am I going to buy my own house? How can I make my own career if I don't climb this corporate ladder? And I do understand that. I just think that there's more to life, probably. And for a lot of these talented, privileged people, my message is, look, you can only drive one car at a time, right? At some point, it's okay. And then other things become much more important. And it would be a shame if you lie on your deathbed and you're like, oh, as you said, I've been climbing the wrong ladder my whole life.
Right. You've spoken about how awareness is the best starting point, while for many it has become the end goal. What do you think we need to do in order to become a more satisfied individual, make a difference? And what is the problem, according to you, with the kind of activism that we see?
The reason I wanted to write this book is that, honestly, I became a little bit fed up with myself. I'm a writer. I spent 10 years of my career providing my opinions from the sidelines. Indeed, as you mentioned, shouting things like taxes, taxes, taxes when I was invited to Davos. And that can be very satisfying, but it's also quite easy. Here I was, on the sidelines, watching the people who are doing the real work, who are in the arena, with the sweat on their faces. And I started experiencing this emotion that I like to describe as moral envy. I was just jealous of the people who have some skin in the game, who do the real work. And I indeed realized that awareness is vastly overrated. I had spent 10 years in the awareness industry, providing my opinions. But very often, people don't do much with what they know. To give you one simple example, most people know that billions of animals are terribly tortured in what we call factory farms. Or we can know about that at least, but most of us just choose to ignore that. So the real challenge is in bridging the gap from awareness to action, to actually do something. And so I wanted to write a book that would be a big kick in the butt for myself, that would force myself to make a difference. And hopefully it's helpful for others as well. I've, as I said, I've co-founded this organization now, completely changed my life, turned into a social entrepreneur. And that has taught me many lessons, and also, caused me to believe that it might be possible for others as well.
All right, just stay with that thought, Rutger. We have to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. When we return, this conversation with Rutger Bregman, the Dutch historian, will continue on his book, Moral Ambition. We'll get you much more after this break. Welcome back. You're watching CNBC-TV18, and we are in conversation with the Dutch historian Rutger Bregman on his latest book, Moral Ambition. I just want to go back to that Davos moment of 2019 when you called out billionaires for tax avoidance, for using for burning aviation fuel to fly down to Davos in private jets as well. How was that moment in your career as a historian, as an author? Were you invited to Davos again after that incident? And what was the kind of feedback you received?
So for some reason, they never invited me back. I guess it was something I said that they didn't particularly like. But I have been wondering, obviously, after those years, like, how can we make more progress in the fight against tax avoidance and tax evasion? Because wherever you go, whether it's the United Kingdom or India, the United States or the Netherlands, everywhere billionaires have lower effective tax rates than working class people. And that seems to me utterly unreasonable and utterly unfair. Now, you can just shout that and say that and go viral for it, but wouldn't it be much more effective to build a SWAT team, a very dedicated cohort of people who want to dedicate their career to fighting for tax avoidance and tax justice? So that's what we're doing right now. We are starting a campaign on Wall Street in New York. We are recruiting the best wealth managers, the best bankers, the best fiscal lawyers, and we are convincing them to pivot their career, basically saying, look, you're now working on the wrong side. You can leave your job and work for us. It's only going to be for the best of the best. So it's very hard to get into one of our fellowships, as we call them. But that's what we're going to do. We've already been doing it for other cause areas. So, for example, in Europe, we've recruited a bunch of marketeers and corporate lawyers who quit their job in order to fight the tobacco industry, big tobacco. And in this way, we want to make doing good more fashionable. We think that we should move towards a world where the best and brightest work on the most important global problems. It's as simple as that.
Right. You also said that when you start off with your thinking process about what kind of change you want to bring about, you should really try and understand what does the world need right now, and whether your approach or what you're working towards can go wrong maybe 10 years down the line and cause more harm to society. Keeping that in mind, which are some of the biggest, if you had to say, top 3 world problems that entrepreneurs can start thinking of working towards right now and maybe have a cult to work around with?
Yeah. So I'm not sure how famous the Lord of the Rings trilogy is in India, but that's always the comparison I like to make. Gandalf, the wise wizard, he never asked Frodo, hey, Frodo, what's your passion? Right? He said, look, if you want to save the world, this is what you need to do. You need to throw the ring into the fiery mountain, right? And that's also how we like to work. So we work with so-called prioritization research. It's a whole branch of social science, people who spend a lot of time thinking about, indeed, the question you just asked. What are the biggest problems we face as a species right now? It's difficult to make a definitive ranking, but there are a couple of obvious examples that come to mind. Think, for example, the threat of the next pandemic. We've just gone through a pretty bad one, COVID, that cost us 20 million lives across the globe. And still we know that the next one could be much, much worse. Then you wonder how many people are currently working on preventing that next pandemic. And it's really outrageous. So currently, the whole world spends only $1 billion on researching emerging infectious diseases. That's about as much as Americans spend bleaching their teeth every year. You've got the Convention Against Bioweapons, a very important organization, and it has the budget of an average McDonald's franchise. So it's super, super neglected. We need way more smart doctors, inventors, entrepreneurs, lobbyists to fight for global health and for pandemic prevention. There are also so many innovations that need to be done here. So that's one example. Now I can go on for a long time. Another one that I think is really, really important is the fight against factory farming. I think if the historians will look back on our age and will think about, okay, what are some of the most immoral things people did back then? I think the way we treat animals is very high up on that list. We're talking about 80 billion animals slaughtered every year. And every week, scientists come in with new evidence about how sensitive and how sentient these animals are, even though we lock them up in these horrible prisons where they don't see the daylight only if they go to the slaughterhouse, perhaps. So that for me is one of those examples where historians will look back on us and say, oh my God, that is like similar to the people who practiced slavery or the people who, did all kinds of other horrible things in the past.
Right. You've spoken about the need for lowering your threshold to act. You've said that at different points in history, every individual has their own threshold to act, a tipping point to taking action. How do we lower that threshold? If you were explaining that to someone in college, or maybe a young student who's finishing school and going to college, how would you explain that?
So when I was a young boy, I was fascinated by the history of the Second World War in my own country of the Netherlands. As you probably know, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands and started abducting many, many Jews. And many of them, millions of them, were murdered in concentration camps. And there was just a small percentage of the population that resisted the Nazis at the time. And already as a young boy, I was fascinated by the question, what made these people different? Why were some people so brave that they would risk their own lives to help persecuted people? And I've done a lot of research into that question for this book, and I discovered that there actually isn't such a thing as the altruistic personality type. There have been lots of studies, hundreds of interviews done, but researchers really couldn't find anything. These very brave people, they could be men or women, rich or poor, young, old. It's really a cross-section of the population. But what they did discover was that this resistance was very contagious. So there was one factor in particular that predicted very well whether people would join the resistance, yes or no. And it was the question, were you asked to join the resistance, right? In 96% of cases, when people were asked to join the resistance, people said yes. So that creates a very different perspective on how we can actually make a difference and indeed lower our threshold to act. It's by surrounding ourselves with other brave people, with other morally ambitious people, because then it can become infectious. And that's exactly what you saw during the Second World War, is that resistance wasn't evenly spread out over the country. No, there were like pockets, local pockets of resistance, where people started infecting each other and they saw other people doing brave things. And then they were like, hey, maybe I can do that as well. And got to remember, it often starts small, right? You take a first step and then another step and then it escalates and you become someone who you never thought you could become. And I think that's the way we lower our threshold to act.
Okay, you've spoken about how you once saw a school which said Hogwarts for Do Gooders. Would you say we need more Hogwarts for Do Gooders around the world?
Absolutely. We need many, many more of them. This is an extraordinary school based in London. It's a little bit like a startup incubator, but it doesn't help people to start their own for-profit to make as much money as possible. No, it helps you to build a non-profit that helps as many people as possible. So it's incredibly hard to get into. It's only for the best of the best. If you've gone to Harvard, well, that's very nice, but it's not nearly enough. And then they incubate all these kind of non-profits. Quite a few of them work in India, by the way, because they're really looking to maximize their impact, to save as many lives as possible, for example, and help as many people as possible. And it's just a beautiful example of how we can redefine success. I think that throughout history, we've often seen that societal renewal starts with a redefinition of what it means to be successful. And currently around the world, we are sadly ruled by, the most immoral elites. I currently live in New York in the United States, and it's a pretty clear example where you have, a whole establishment that is becoming more and more immoral by the day. But we've been here before, and I think there can be a counter-revolution. We've seen that in the UK in the late 18th century. We've seen it in the United States in the 19th and the early 20th century, when people of privilege stepped forward and said, okay, now it is enough. And now we're going to make a difference, not by pointing at others, not by blaming others and using the finger. No, it is by doing better ourselves, by giving a better example ourselves. And that's what we desperately need today.
Okay, my final question would be, in the India context, how do you think individuals, citizens can raise their moral ambition Today, there is great power competition in the world, to put it very simply. It's about who is going to lead the AI revolution, who's going to lead the economic race, who's going to be the strongest player in the manufacturing supply chain. So when you have this great power competition between India and China, China and the United States, fight for supremacy at the top, what kind of moral ambition do you feel that someone in the Indian context needs to have?
Well, at the heart of being morally ambitious, there's the recognition that we humans all have equal dignity, all have equal worth. So it is absolutely fine to care deeply about your own country. But I think that we should move towards a world where all countries can flourish, where all nations can flourish. And if anyone, in India is watching this and, maybe went to one of those top universities, I think the message of this book and my message today is use your privilege, not just check your privilege, but use your privilege to make the world a wildly better place. And obviously it makes a lot of sense to start in your own country because there are still so many big challenges to solve in India. If I only think about, the health aspects, one of the most cost-effective interventions, for example, is just to make sure a bigger percentage of the population is vaccinated. You can do an insane amount of good in that way. Yeah, just think about your life in a bigger way. Think about how you want to be remembered. I think that's the main message of the book.
All right, Rutger, thank you so much for your views on your book, Moral Ambition. That's all we had time for on this broadcast. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.